All right, welcome everybody, and welcome to the Friends of the Cabildo's um, 11th annual symposium. Today, we're going to be spending the day talking about the Marquis de Lafayette. When I originally, the original reasoning for this was that obviously he came to New Orleans in 2020, 1825, and it's an anniversary. But doing some research and speaking with people, there seemed to be some real interest in the Marquis and kind of his life. It is an unbelievable life, and we will dive deeper into it. We're going to have speakers all day. Obviously, everything is recorded so that you can watch it later on. But we're gonna kind of work our way through his career until we get to at the end of the day. We will have a lecture about the exhibit that will open next year at the Louisiana State Museum's Cabildo, and we'll learn a little bit more about that. So with that, we're going to kick off the day. It's 9:45. Um, um, our speaker is Dr. Charles Chamberlain. Dr. Chamberlain is a former curator of education at the Louisiana State Museum. He teaches public history at the University of New Orleans, and has been just a great resource for this symposium, helping out with themes and speakers throughout the years. So he is going to be talking about Lafayette before the Revolution. So we're going to get some background information before he gets over here to New Orleans in his two major time, in the U.S. before his two major times in the U.S. So I want to welcome Dr. Charles Chamberlain. Charles, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you, Jason, and welcome everybody to the symposium, the Friends of Cabildo, for December 14th, 2024. If y'all don't mind, I'm going to minimize the gallery to show my presentation here. So I'm going to start off, and I'm basically presenting on the history of Marquis de Lafayette, his life up to the American Revolution. And so you see a number of images here associated with his life during this time period, um, including some kind of more propaganda material with fighting for the American freedom, and then a formal portrait, and also some paintings commemorating his service to the United States, as well as his wife and his children as well. So I'm going to begin. He was born September 6th, 1757. His full name, and this is a very long French noble name, which is Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert de Mortier. And throughout the presentation, I'll generally refer to him as Gilbert, his first name. And this is, I don't know, my decision to kind of personalize him rather than Lafayette, his last name, his title. I want to make it more personal. So, what I wanted to do here is set up the context of his existence in his youth. And so, this is towards the end of the Ancien Regime, which is the French royal crown their last years. And so the House of Bourbon's reign, which had actually lasted from Henri IV, Henry IV, in 1589 all the way to the French Revolution in 1789. So really a 200-year period. So he comes at the very end of that. And this is the context of France at this time, in which there is immense wealth within the nobility and the court itself. And this is juxtaposed against the rest of France in terms of feudalism and poverty and increasingly high taxes, which then leads to the French Revolution of 1789. And part of this is because Louis XV and Louis XVI basically financed the American Revolution, and the cost is so high they end up creating such high taxes that that it leads to the revolution. So it's also the context of the 7 Years' War, which existed from 1755 roughly to 1763. And this is when France went to war against England. It's considered partly the first global war, but also I think of it as 700 years of war between France and England. And also, it's the age of revolution, which begins with the American Revolution in 1776 and it spreads over most of the Western Hemisphere and also part of Europe as well. So, Gilbert was raised in Auvergne, which is a region of southern France. I'll get more into that in just a second. But he's raised in an isolated estate amidst a beautiful, rugged landscape. And it's near the Allier River, valley, and gorge. And this is a tributary of the Loire River, the Haute Loire, the Upper Loire in south central France. And I'm going to show you some maps in just a second. And then also, his region in which he was raised of southern France is distinct from northern France in terms of it's the historic Languedoc region. They have a different dialect, a different language from northern France. And one of the questions I would actually ask Mike Duncan is, how would his upbringing in terms of being raised in Auvergne with a more southern orientation affect his ability to adapt to the culture and language of northern France? And so southern France and in general the Auvergne region is known as a region of hardy people, culture, and cuisine. And so this includes regional wines and cheeses, heavy meals of pork and beef stews. They're known for their stuffed cabbage with sausages. Some of their regional dishes include aligot, which is potatoes and cheese dish, and truffade, which is a potato pancake cooked in goose fat, and also green lentil soup. And then in the summer, you would have fresh berries, and then also a blackberry caramel tart. And so over to the right, we have these images of the Marquis de Lafayette as a young man, and then also the Church of Saint Michel, which is in the town nearby where he grew up. So I want to kind of basically embrace the idea of the environment and the region in which he grew up of southern France. So he grew up in the Chateau de Lafayette in Chavignac de Lafayette, and this is a region of southern France which is culturally is very distinct from northern France. And people from the south view themselves as very different from the north. And so I often question, and this is a question I would raise to Mike Duncan, how would his southern upbringing, of course, affect his career and his growing up? So just to give you a general idea of the map here, so this is a map of southern France. It's a Google screenshot here, but Clermont-Ferrand is one of the big cities to the northwest of where he grew up. That is now the home of Michelin tires, and then also Lyon, considered, it's actually the second biggest city in France and considered one of the culinary capitals of France. It's to the northeast. So you get the idea of the general region. So it's east of Bordeaux, north of Montpellier on the Mediterranean coast, and honestly, it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. So here's a kind of a closer view. And so he grew up in the administrative region now known as Haute Loire, the upper Loire Valley. And this is a region of, again, it's kind of isolated region of the Massif Central. Let me go back here. So in terms of French geography, the south central region of France is known as the Massif Central, which is a high upper plateau of volcanic activity. It is the source of many rivers that flow throughout France. And so this is why it's called the Upper Loire, the Haute Loire, because it's the source of the Loire River, which is one of the bigger rivers of France in general. So here's a close-up of the Haute Loire. And some of the highlights would be up here in the northwest, Clermont-Ferrand. Up here in the northeast would be Lyon. And then Saint-Étienne is kind of a bigger city. honestly, this is kind of aside, but I found out about this region partly because my daughter was a fan of Timothy Chalamet, the actor, who's now gotten a lot of press for portraying Bob Dylan. But his grandparents grew up in a region of Haute-Loire in the southeast region called Chambon-Solignon. And so he's from this region, which is, again, a very isolated rural region. And so this kind of provides the context. And so now I want to provide the context for the Haute-Loire and give you an idea about the food and the geography, just to kind of set the context overall. So here's images of a heavy pork meal with vegetables in the top left corner, and then cheeses and olives and nuts in the top on the bottom right corner, and then images of the volcanic region here and Polignac, which is a nearby town, which he must have visited, Lafayette, many times. And you can see the kind of the general landscape is very rural, with hills and regions all around that are this black volcanic rock. So in terms of the context, I do want to set it up that nearby is the town of Polignac.
Charles, Charles,
Yeah.
we're having a little bit issue with maybe some people are saying that we didn't share our screen. Are people seeing the screen?
Yes.
They are seeing it, right? You saying seeing the screen? Okay. Yes. Okay. Well, let me pop back out. Someone else emailed me. I'll see if I can fix their problem. Thanks. Sorry, Charles.
Yeah, no worries. So anyway, in terms of the region, Polignac is a town near where he grew up. And so this is an image of the Forteresse de Polignac from the 11th century. And this raises the issue of military defense of the region overall. And so this is really connected to Lafayette's career in the military and his family's service to the military overall. And what is very interesting is that this is a fortress on top of this hilltop, volcanic hilltop, and generally these historic hilltops were used for protection way back all the way to the Celtic period, so the pre-Roman period. The Celtic people generally lived on top of what they called oppidum, which are hilltop fortresses. And so generally all these hilltop fortresses that were created in the Middle Ages really are descended from the original hilltop fortresses of this Celtic people in the pre-Roman period. So also nearby, the biggest town is Le Puy-en-Velay, which is very interesting because it's on the Saint-Jacques de Compostelle Trail. This is the pilgrimage trail leading to northwestern Spain, and it had been on the trail since the 5th century. So it has a long history of Catholic spiritualism and belief. It's also the home of La Vierge Noire, the Black Virgin. And here's the image of the Black Virgin here at the Cathédrale Notre Dame, which is basically depicted down here in this image. So it's the main cathedral of Le Puy-en-Velay. And so Le Puy-en-Velay is an interesting town in terms of it has this hilltop rock covered with the Church of Saint Martin, who's the patron saint of France, and then the town is overseen by La Vierge, the Virgin holding the baby in this huge statue. And so again, it reconnects basically the volcanic environment with the Catholic spiritualism of the region overall. And so this is very important in kind of summarizing the importance of the region. So in terms of military and also Catholic history, Lafayette must have felt a strong connection to both of those threads of history. So he was raised at the Le Chateau de Chauvignac-Lafayette. The region is Auvergne, France. It's a volcanic region, as I mentioned. So the chateau was built in the 14th century as a manor house. It's flanked by 2 large towers. 18 rooms, so a very beautiful home, partially destroyed by fire in 1701. Lafayette actually resided there in the two different time periods from 1757 to 1768 when he was a young man, and then later as an adult from 1783 to 1797. And then the later history of the building is that by 1916, it went through a number of uses, but it was bought by American industrialist John Moffett to preserve the history of the building and its importance as related to Lafayette. And now the chateau is run by the Lafayette Memorial Association. If anyone is interested in the history of the building, I encourage you all to check it out. It's detailed in the article by Richard Eden called The Real John Moffett in the Eugene O'Neill Review, published in 2009. And so this is available on the internet if you have access to JSTOR. But if anyone is interested, it's a great article explaining that. So here's an overview of kind of the screenshot of the satellite view of Chateau Lafayette. You can see the building itself here, the two towers and the central building, and then what they call the Parc de Chateau de Chevignac Lafayette, and the town nearby. And then here's some pictures of it. I think this is an older picture before recent renovations, but you see the central building and the two towers on the side. And then if you look at this picture, you see that they have really fixed it up in terms of adding more ornamental detail and color to the building itself. So going on, the House of Lafayette, his father's family was a family of French nobility and also a family of immense land ownership. And so his father's name was Michel Louis Christophe Roch Gilbert Paulette de Mortier, Marquis de Lafayette. He lived from 1731 to 1759. He was a colonel in the French Royal Military. He commanded the elite Grenadier assault troops for the French military, and he died in the Battle of Minden in Westphalia, which is present-day Germany, during the 7 Years' War, as depicted below. And so this is a war in which France fought Britain and also the Prussian troops in the French assault of Hanover, Germany. And it led to his sons, Gilbert Lafayette, the subject of our conference here, his lifelong loathing of the British because of his death. So in 1759, with the death of his father, Gilbert inherited his father's titles, and that would include the Marquis de Lafayette, the Lord de Chavignac. And then the estate actually went to his mother, and this is because in French law, the Code Civil, women could inherit property. So this is very important to acknowledge. So this brings up the history of his mother, Marie Louise Joly de la Rivière, who lived from 1737 to 1770. Her image is below. She was actually born in Thamesbury, Somerset, England, which I find ironic, considered that the Marquis de Lafayette, the subject of the conference, detested British people, but his mom was born in England. And honestly, this kind of conveys the complexity of the relationship of French people to English people during this time. Anyway, she was married in 1754. Both of her parents were very politically connected to the royal court. Her father was Joseph-Yves Thibault Hyacinthe, Marquis de la Rivière, and he was a nobility of Normandy, so northwest France, very different from South France, where Lafayette was raised. And then they had large land holdings, and he is depicted at bottom right down here. So this is the mother up here on the bottom top right, and this is the father down here. So her mother was Julie Louise Celeste de la Rivière, who lived from 1721 to 1753. And her grandfather, her maternal grandfather, was Charles Yves Thibault, Hyacinthe de la Rivière, Comte de la Rivière. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this first part is these families of nobility with these very long names with titles. But anyway, her grandfather was the commander of the Mousquetaires du Roi, basically the king's musketeers. So this is King Louis XV's personal horse guards who fought technically as both infantry and cavalry. And her grandmother, this is very interesting in terms of New Orleans history, was born Julie Louise Barbarin, which when I found this out yesterday, I just happened to like dive deeper. The name Barbarin was a name familiar with New Orleans history, especially New Orleans jazz history. Louis Barbarin and all the Barbarin family who are very prominent in New Orleans music history. So this is a side note, but I question what is their relationship to the Barbarin family of New Orleans. And then just in general, the Mousquetaires du Roi, the king's musketeers, were among the most prestigious of the military companies in the area of the Ancien Regime, the Bourbon era. And so membership was reserved strictly for nobles. And here's an image of the Mousquetaires over time. And so if you look at this this illustration, the illustration depicting the Mousquetaire of 1772 in the center, that would most likely be the type of uniform worn by Lafayette when he was a member of this. So now we go back to Gilbert's youth in the Auvergne. And so from August 1st, 1759, his father was struck by a cannonball at the Battle of Minden. He dies. Gilbert is almost 2 years old, so he's just really a toddler. His father is actually only 28 years old, so that's quite young to die in terms of a soldier. But his mother, in response, leaves for Paris to live with her father and her grandfather at the Palais de Luxembourg, and we'll get to that in a minute. So Gilbert remains at Chauvignac-Lafayette in Auvergne to be raised by his paternal grandmother, Madame de Chauvignac. So I always ask the question, and I want to ask this question to Mike Duncan, how did his experience in Auvergne affect his upbringing? And according to the website of the Chateau de Chauvignac, they argue that, of course, it supported a strong Catholic faith. It also supported an independent nature, which would make sense in terms of rebelling against his family and going to America to fight for the war, but also a reverence for nature and spiritualism as well. So I would be very curious to know what Mike Duncan says about this, and that would be one of my first questions for him. But in general, also, I want to discuss the history, the deep history of the House of Lafayette. So this is the shield up at the right is the shield of the House of Lafayette. And they're a distinguished noble family in France since the 14th century. One of the famous ancestors of Lafayette was Gilbert Mortier de Lafayette, which is almost the same name as him. He was the Marshal of France, meaning basically the general of the army during the early 1400s, especially with the siege of Orleans and the era of Jeanne d'Arc during the 100 Years' War. And so they go way back. And then one of his other very important ancestors is Marie Madeleine Pioche de la Verge, Comtesse de la Lafayette, and that's she grew up from 1634 to 1693. But she is known as the author of this very famous novel in French history, is La Princesse de Clèves, published in 1678. It's considered France's first novel and one of the first in literature history, published anonymously, based, I think, on her gender, but her image is at right. So a very interesting family history overall. And I don't mean to sidetrack, but I think it's very important to acknowledge the deep history overall. So finally, in 1768, Gilbert's 11 and he moves to Paris, and he receives an early military education. So he finally leaves Auvergne and moves to Paris, the sophisticated big city, where he lives with his mother and her grandfather, Le Comte de la Rivière at the Luxembourg Palace. So the Luxembourg Palace is generally known as the French Senate. Today, it's in the Luxembourg Gardens. If anyone has been to Paris, Luxembourg Gardens are one of the interesting tourist sites in the arrondissement around the Sorbonne. And so here's some images. It actually, in 1799, was the palace of Napoleon when he first came to power. And so beyond that, Gilbert was sent to study at the Collège de Duplessis, which is part of the Sorbonne. So the collège in France is generally like a middle school for people in America, the junior high age. And then his grandfather, Le Comte de la Rivière, enrolled Gilbert in a program to train future musketeers. So this is when he really begins his military career. So by May 1771, at age 14, Gilbert was commissioned as a sous-lieutenant of the Mousquetaires. And then his duties included marching in the military parades and then presenting himself to King Louis XV, who is pictured at right, who ended up died in 1774. And here's an image of the Palais du Luxembourg and the Luxembourg Gardens in a summer sunset evening. So it's a beautiful place to visit. If you're ever in Paris, I think it's a very calm area. It's kind of an oasis amidst all the chaos of all the rest of the hubbub of the Le Cinquième, the fifth arrondissement. So now that brings us to his marriage to Marie Adrien Françoise de Noailles in 1774. So, is a little bit of background. In 1770, his mother, Marie Louise, died, and then her father, the Comte de la Rivière, also died. So it was kind of a heavy year for him. Meanwhile, Gilbert inherits 25,000 livres, and then from his grandfather, 120,000 livres, which is the equivalent of 45,000 pounds, and then today's equivalent of 99,000 pounds, English pounds today. So that puts him in really the 1% of the French elite. And then meanwhile, so he's a very rich man inheriting all this money, the Jean-Paul François de Noailles, the Duc d'Ayen, the son of Louis, the fourth Duke of Noailles, the Marshal of France, is searching for a suitor for his 12-year-old daughter, Marie Adrienne Françoise. And this seems kind of outrageous to search for a suitor for your 12-year-old daughter. And I agree, as Gilbert is seen as a suitor. And the Duke's wife, Henriette Anne-Louise d'Aguesseau, who's pictured up at the top right with his hat, she's opposed to the relationship, believing that the couple is too young. And a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old about to get married, this seems outrageous by today's standards. But an arrangement was made to let the two meet and get to know each other over 2 years. And so indeed, they purportedly fell in love. So the couple married in 1774. They remained married until her death in 1807. Her image is at the bottom right, this beautiful image right here, very delicate woman. And she raised their 4 children and managed the household largely by herself between 1775 and 1782. So I think it's very important to give her a lot of credit for what she accomplished in the context of Lafayette serving overseas in the American War. And then meanwhile, she was left at home struggling with managing this household. So now we move on to Lafayette's sympathy towards the American rebels. So in 1774, following the marriage, Gilbert and Marie, Gilbert 17 and Marie's 15, they moved to Versailles, the royal palace, and where he continued his military studies at the Academy de Versailles. And then his image is at right as a young man. And again, I would like to acknowledge that they're staying at the Palais de Luxembourg, the Luxembourg Palace, and then Versailles really reflects their ultra elite status at the time. And then, meanwhile, the year before, Gilbert, 16 years old, had received a commission as the lieutenant in the Noailles Dragoons. And this is thanks to his father-in-law, who really appears as quite controlling. And so the Noailles Dragoons are basically military people who ride on horseback and then dismount and then fight as infantry. So this is his kind of specialty. And then meanwhile, the next year, 1775, at 18 years old, Gilbert took part in the unit's annual training at Metz, which is in eastern France on the German border in the Departement de Lorraine. So there he befriended Charles-François de Bourguil, Marquis de Lafayette. And he was in charge of the Army of the East in terms of the commander, is viewed at right in this watercolor painting. He's from a Piedmontese family from northern Italy, essentially, accepted as part of the nobility of French royalty. He's also part of Louis XV, the king, his secret diplomatic team, the Secrétaire, likely, which were pro-American early on as the American rebels are starting to rebel, of course, against the British crown. So, Charles-François and Gilbert apparently discussed the American rebels' intentions and French diplomacy. Bourguil organized a dinner, a very important dinner, in kind of a transition in really reaffirming Gilbert's commitment to the American cause. So on August 8, 1775, in Metz, Gilbert met King George III's brother, Duc de Gloucester, who helped form his initial support for the American cause. By meeting the Duke of Gloucester, Gilbert realized that he really was committed to the idea of liberty and freedom and democracy. So as a new Freemason, also, he was initiated into the Freemason Benevolent Club. The rebellion of the Americans likely appealed to Gilbert's ideals overall. And today, in Metz, along the river in the center of town, there's a statue of the Marquis de Lafayette that was installed in 2004. And it shows him mounted on a horse with his sword, his horse rearing up. And so this is really to honor the Marquis de Lafayette's time in Metz and his commitment to the American rebellion. So now this brings us to the American Rebellion and the relationship of the American rebels and the French crown. So in 1776, Minister Silas Deane met with the Comte de Vergennes. And so this is when Silas Deane, who's a representative, a delegate from the Continental Congress of the Americas, then begins to meet with the Bourbon crown at Versailles. So, stepping back a little bit, September 75, Gilbert returns to Paris. He leaves Metz. He receives a commission as a captain in the Dragoons, as promised by his father-in-law as a wedding present. So, to me, this is kind of like a gift where, hey, I'm going to give you this, but you owe me. And this is the Duc d'Ayen, who will then require Gilbert to follow along the commands of the Duc d'Ayen, but this leads to a conflict. That's a side story. So in 1776, meanwhile, the relations begin between France and the American rebels. Silas Deane, who's the envoy from the Continental Congress, viewed at top right, and then Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, who is Louis XVI's Minister of Foreign Affairs. So Louis XVI became king in 1774 with the death of Louis XV. And by the way, in terms of New Orleans, Charles Gravier, we have Gravier Street. I have often tried to research the history of the Gravier family and its potential connection to Charles Gravier. I have still yet to find any specific connections. But if anyone has any knowledge of this, I would love to know. And I know the Gravier family of the Faubourg Saint-Marie and Bertrand and Jean Gravier of New Orleans are considered originating in Bordeaux. But I have a feeling they originate in terms of their family history in Dijon, where Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, came from. So anyway, that's an aside in relation to New Orleans history. But so Lafayette, now despite his youth at 19 years old, wanted to be included in the French participation in the American cause. So Silas Deane enlisted Lafayette as a major general in the French-American forces. And Silas Deane was very generous. He really wanted to include every possible French military personnel as possible in the American cause, and he kind of overdid it. But meanwhile, Britain threatened war when they heard of the French plans to send direct aid and military personnel. And so French delayed the plan. This is an image of Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes down here at the bottom. Here's Silas Deane at the top right. So now we're coming towards the end. 1777, Lafayette visits London and meets George III. So the Duc d'Ayen, his father-in-law, discouraged the idea of serving the American rebel attempt and encouraged Lafayette as Gilbert to visit his uncle, the Marquis de Noailles, whose official name is Emmanuel Marie Louis de Noailles, who served as the French ambassador to the UK in London from 1776 to 1783. Gilbert was presented to George III, pictured top right, and also General Henry Clinton. Gilbert stayed 3 weeks in London, but the trip did not change his view towards the American cause. And upon his return to France, he avoided and actually hid out from his father-in-law. I love the dynamics of this. Going back to France, he wants to avoid his father-in-law. He's hiding out. Meanwhile, the Duc d'Ayen became very upset with the fact that he was hiding out, and he asked King Louis XVI to issue an order forbidding French officers aimed at Gilbert from serving in America. And there is conjecture that Vergennes, seen as right, ordered Lafayette's arrest. So this now leads us to kind of the conclusion here, and this is Lafayette's departure for the Americas. And so Gilbert, who's had his heart set on serving for the American rebels, he uses his wealth to buy a ship, La Victoire, for 12,000 pounds to sail to America. But unfortunately, his family did not support his intentions. And this includes his father-in-law, of course, and his closer family of his wife. And so his wife also is raising young children. He feels conflicted. So he sails out of Bordeaux, but returns shortly out of mixed emotions. And then the Comte de Noailles, when he arrives back in Bordeaux, orders Gilbert, report to your regiment in Marseille, and which Gilbert pretended to do. He left Bordeaux and then doubled back deceptively, which is part of the drama. I love this drama. And then by March 77, La Victoire, the ship he bought, departed Pauillac, which is a part of the port of Bordeaux, and they have a monument at right, which is depicted in that kind of rusty sculpture. And it left without Gilbert, so to avoid detection by the French crown and the British spies. So pretty smart idea to let the ship leave and then throw off his opponents. And then it moored off the northern Spanish Basque coast port of Pacia, where it took on arms of 5,000 rifles and ammunition made locally. And on the journey, Gilbert bought the ship's cargo to avoid the need to dock in the West Indies. And so the captain wanted to dock in the West Indies. Gilbert said, no, I can't afford that. I might be arrested. I'm just going to buy the cargo. So then by June 13, 1777, La Victoire docked near Georgetown, South Carolina. And there's a historical marker today which basically honors that event. So by July 77, he is volunteering in Philadelphia. So he made his way from South Carolina to Philadelphia, where the Second Continental Congress was overwhelmed with French officers recruited by Dean. Gilbert had studied the English language on the voyage, and this is another question I would have for Mike Duncan is, what is the level of Lafayette's English language comprehension? When did he perhaps first begin to study English? Was it simply on the voyage, or had he already had some kind of knowledge? But anyway, apparently this gave him an advantage in the case for serving the American military. And then additionally, Gilbert's Masonic membership opened doors for his efforts to serve. And then meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin, who was also serving with Dean as the American emissary to France, wrote a letter to Congress in support of Lafayette's service. Franklin's son Temple had actually befriended Gilbert in Paris during 1776. So this is another whole complex story. But Temple really advocated for the service of Lafayette. They're about the same generation. So Benjamin Franklin being much older, like the grandfatherly age. So meanwhile, July 31st, 1777, Congress commissioned Lafayette as a major general in the rebel forces. And then we have images of the Second Continental Congress. And then meanwhile, in August 77, August 3rd, this is the big meeting, and I'm leading up to the end of this time period, Lafayette meets George Washington at a dinner in Philadelphia. So Washington apparently was impressed with Lafayette's enthusiasm for the rebel cause. They also felt a common bond through their membership in the Masons. Lafayette became a member of Washington's staff, but his honorary commission by the Congress as a foreign-born officer initially prevented him from serving as commander of a division. So interestingly, in the long term, their strong relationship led Lafayette to name his son Georges Washington de Lafayette. And he was born in 1779, died in 1849. His image is depicted at the top right. I'll show you a little bit more of a close-up there. And then also Lafayette had several daughters. The first was Henriette, who lived until 2 years old. Unfortunately, she died at 2. And then Anastasie Louise, who lived from 1777 to 1863. She lived a long time, almost 90 years. And then Marie Antoinette Virginie, and both of these are depicted at right. So this is Anastasie at the kind of the top left, and then Virginie at the bottom right. And then meanwhile, I wanted to show you this well-known image. It's Jacques-Louis David, the famous French painter of this time period. It's his painting, The Oath of Lafayette at the Festival of the Federation, July 14th, 1790, to commemorate the first year of the Revolution. So this is Lafayette pictured in the center. This museum is held at the Musée Carnavalet in Paris. And the Marais, it's basically a museum of the history of Paris. But in relevance to this, there's the 11-year-old Georges on the podium at right in the blue coat. And it's my theory that it's the two daughters, Anastasie and Marie Antoinette, who were down here in front. I have not been able to provide any confirmation, but maybe Mike Duncan knows, and so we'll ask Mike. So anyway, moving on, here is a depiction of Lafayette meeting George Washington in 1777 on August 3rd. This is a lithograph that was created in 1874 basically in honor of the centennial of the United States and honoring Lafayette's service. So now, in conclusion, I will basically summarize Lafayette's life up to the American Revolution. So there's several points I want to make. Number one, his nobility. So his nobility enabled him as a youth to receive excellent military education, which served him well in America with military experience and training. And number two, his wealth. So his wealth enabled him to buy La Victoire and the ship's cargo, which enabled him to travel directly from France, or actually Spain, to South Carolina and avoid arrest. And then third, the Masonic connections. They endowed a sense of trust with the American rebels. And then fourth, the Republican rebel, that is this characteristic of Lafayette, So although Gilbert supported the French crown and his father-in-law by loyalty, he also he was foresighted enough to embrace the Republican ideals of liberty, democracy, and also freedom of worship, which he applied in the Rights of Man document. So very important in terms of gaining respect from the Americans. And then also his contempt for Britain. So based on his father's death and also the French political cultural orientation, Gilbert easily held contempt for the British cause. And then lastly, and this is one of, I think, the most interesting points of his life and his legacy, is the complex irony that despite his noble Catholic French status, the Americans embraced and adored Lafayette as a hero of the American Revolution, which is almost an antithesis to the American ideal of being a noble French Catholic person. But because of his service and his military expertise and his commitment to the cause, Americans loved him. So, in conclusion, I often add the idea of, if anyone wants to study any of these subjects further, I offer advice for further reading. So first is Mike Duncan, who's coming up next, and I can't wait to hear his talk. So he wrote Hero of the Two Worlds, Marquis de Lafayette and the Edge of Revolution, published in 2021. And then I would also recommend Memoirs de General Lafayette with an account of his visit to America, published in 2011. And also Jason Lane's The General and Madame de Lafayette, Partners in Liberty's Cause, published in 2003. And you see some of these book covers listed here. And then in terms of historical novels, Stephanie Drey's The Women of Chateau Lafayette, published in 2021. And then in general context, I recommend Stephen Clark's 1,000 Years of Annoying the French, published in 2015. This is generally about the context of the relationship between the British and the French. And what I would add, just in conclusion, is that it's more complex than one would understand. And that is, British and the French have so much in common. A lot of the English language is based on French. There's a strong connection between Normandy and Brittany and England. And so it's just fun to read this history written by Stephen Clark, which is quite humorous, but also easy to read. So with that, I will conclude, and I think my time is up.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. I think we've set an amazing base for today as we move along in the story of Lafayette. If anybody does have any questions, we do have time. We have some wiggle room with the lunch break. So if there are any questions, you're welcome to ask them. If not, I'm go ahead and put everybody in the waiting room, and then we'll get started in just a few minutes for